Hey, 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 we are live. Hello, everybody. My name is Otavio Santana, and today is one more episode of Deploy Friday because every day is a day to deploy your application with Platform.sh, right? Today, let's talk a little bit about MicroProfile. If you are a Java developer, would like to take your application and move in the next level, using microservice, why not use microprofile? I'm here with my colleague. Hello, Chad. How's
Hey,
it going?
Otavio.
Glad to be here with you again. And let's talk with our guest. Hello, Emily. How's it going?
Hi, Otavio. Yeah, I'm good. It's great to be here at Deploy on Friday. Deploy on Friday. It's a
Oh, that's
great
amazing.
name.
Yes, that's our slogan. So, Emily, could you introduce yourself? Who are you? Where are you based?
Yeah. Hi, everybody. I'm Emily Jiang. I work for IBM. I'm based in the UK. Actually, I work in IBM Hersley lab. So I work on the open source projects, open liberty, and micro profile. So that's my passion.
Ho ho, thank you, Emily. And right now, Roberto. Hello, Roberto. How's it going?
Hi, Otavio. Everything's going okay. Thank you very much. And thank you so much for the invitation to be here with you guys today.
Oh, that's my pleasure, especially when you decide to use the DBZ background. That was my favorite one. I mean, so
Yeah, of
far the
course.
best one.
I always pick things that people like.
So, Roberto, could you introduce yourself? I
Yes,
know
of
you are
course.
Dragon Ball Z huge
Yeah,
fan.
yeah,
What else?
definitely. I do have like a huge collection of figures. Anyway, yes, I'm Roberto Cortez. I'm based in Portugal. At the moment, I'm working for Red Hat, and in Red Hat, I'm one of the leads for small right projects, which are implementations for MicroProfile. And SmallRye actually feeds on multiple other projects like Wildfly, Thorntail, Quarkus, and even Liberty. So it's kind of like a crazy amount of work because we have to maintain all of these implementations working on all these other upstream servers, right? So that's what I do.
Oh, amazing. Okay, we're gonna talk about microprofile, but first, what is Microsoft architecture? Could you guys explain a little bit to us? And how can I do that with Java?
Right. So I will start with that. Actually, I'm the Liberty microservice architect. so I have been looking at a microservice for a few years. So microservice architect, basically microservice again is kind of the piece of the software, right? Is a kind of is can do one thing and do one thing very well, and then it's maintain its own release cycle and etc. And then in microservice is kind of it should be cloud native. Basically, it has a lot of the quality of services like written once, configure everywhere, and also it should fulfill the 12-factor app this characteristic, like externalize your configuration, resilient, and fast startup, and fast shutdown, etc. So that's why the micro profile was the kind of great framework for doing microservices because it can manage the quality service for you.
Oh, wait. Did you say the 12 fact app? What is that? How can I
Oh,
use?
12-factor app. Yeah, 12-factor app was originated from suddenly forgot the name. Uh, that's very interesting. I will look it up and see that again. So uh, so because it has a 12 factors and like manage your own repository, like version control, and also is kind of the you can easily scale up and scale down, and external like the configuration, and also is kind of the make sure it's dev product parity and etc. Yeah,
Mm.
that's 12 factor.
Oh,
Design
nice.
guidelines for applications, set of 12 specific ones.
Yes.
So I usually like to be more how to say it. I like to break stuff, right? And I'm saying when I like to break stuff, I also like to break notions and definitions, what people try to define stuff. So when you ask what is a microservice, I actually have a very different view on that. I mean, I'm not. I think that Emily is completely right on her definition, but I also believe that every team or every company has their own definition of what a microservice is. So when actually people sometimes go and say, oh, how big should a microservice be? Should it be like 10K bytes? Should it be 10K lines of code? Doesn't really matter, right? Yeah, what actually matters is what you do with that in your own organization. And if you actually think about on everything that came to support microservice and the idea that when you think about microservice, you think about an explosion of services before we have like something that which is a monolith and everything is running on a single machine, right? But that's not scalable. So for that reason, you started to split your monolith up into multiple pieces. But the interesting thing about all of these, about for instance, the 12 factor and everything that came to support microservices can still be applied to monoliths. So for instance, if you look into, and we'll get there, in like frameworks like MicroProfile, which were developed to support microservices, no one is stopping you to use that to build your own monolith if you like. So those are not exclusive things. And a lot of the tooling and a lot of the ideas that came to support things like microservices are still you can still apply them to monoliths as well.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I have a friend of mine who's Elder Moraes. He usually say, microservice is not about scale the application itself. It's more about scale people, right? So if you have like 100 people in just one repository, it might be a huge challenge to handle the whole PR, the whole everything. Sorry,
yeah,
go ahead, Emily.
microservice actually is a culture change. Roberto was absolutely right. So actually, it's for this year at QCon, and people already start questioning about is the microservice a default answer for all scenarios? Actually, monolith has its own reason to exist. So it's some company went to microservice, and then it's found out like the productivity decreased, so they went back to monolith. So basically, it's the kind of the future is kind of microservice and monoliths. Some company might be fine, just stay with the monoliths, or in the future, maybe monoliths become like chop it up and become modular monoliths.
Yes,
Better
so
with the 12 factor.
yeah, go
Sorry,
ahead.
better with better with the 12 factor kind of methodology was published by Heroku originally. So it's the best practices. So it's yeah. So we need to be careful with the culture. If it's one application team, one team, it doesn't make sense to manage hundreds of microservices, and then the productivity might decrease. So you need to kind of have some fine lines.
Yeah, so another thing that I usually when I start to introduce this topic about microservices, I usually, especially because that's a relatively new term, right? I like to introduce some of the history, and I'm pretty sure that all of you already heard the history about Netflix, right? And those were that was the company that popularized this kind of architecture, and they gave us a lot of tooling that didn't exist at the time that they had to build to be able to build this kind of architecture. But I like when I talk about their story, I talk into a business side perspective, right? Because when they have to choose what architecture they were going to implement to serve their business case, they were being highly pressured by other companies that were moving in the same space, right? So they could probably follow a monolith approach that will probably work just as well, but they will take a considerable amount of time to do it. So they ended up splitting things into multiple pieces to be able to build them in parallel. That doesn't, they were able to do it much quicker, but of course they have to spend more resources and more money because they end up having more things in parallel. And as you know, I usually like to do this joke, and I'm pretty sure that you heard this joke as well a couple of times as well, which is a woman cannot build a baby, or 9 women cannot build a baby in 1 month, right?
Yeah.
But in essence, when you're thinking about things, is yes, a monolith is a very good approach for most companies out there, right? Especially if you're low on resources. If you really require microservices, is not only about the architectural design patterns that you have to implement or all the technical aspects about microservices. It also is also culture change. It's also something that has to come from the teams that are working, because instead of having like a team which working on the same pieces all together, you're going to have multiple teams that are going to have to communicate between them, and it's going to be a huge cultural impact for the company if they're not used to work in that direction. And I've seen that fail multiple times, not because the technical was not there, it's because the company didn't have the culture to adopt that kind of methodology, right?
Oh, nice. So right now we have the whole background to know at least a little bit about microservice, what microservice is. And let's move on to the next step, right? Because what is microprofile?
Right, MicroProfile is it's an open source community to establish a programming model for doing microservices. For doing cloud native applications, I think Roberto touched on a bit. So it's the specification is good for to be used in microservices, but it's really good to be used in monoliths as well. So it's so basically it's this is the good APIs for achieve quality services for your applications, I will say.
Yes, for sure. So let me actually go into details. So give a couple of examples on that. So for instance, MicroProfile, we define a metrics application, right? Or a metrics specification. So when you think about a monolith, maybe metrics is something that you want to extract, but it's not so much relevant. But of course, when you're on a microservices world and you have like 10 services, you do need to retrieve those metrics from all of these services to make sure that they are behaving properly, right? Because now you're starting to have other issues that you usually didn't have before, right? When the monolith is down, everything is down, so you don't really care that much, right? Well, you do, but if you have 10 microservices and one is down, then it may take a while for you to understand that one is down, unless someone is using the feature that's implemented over there. So you require more monitoring to figure out what's going on. Now, it is interesting because on monoliths, you also require this kind of monitoring, but no one have ever bothered to do it as we do it right now for microservices, right? In a more detailed way. So actually, microservices ended up, and in the MicroProfile, by doing that, ended up benefiting monolith implementations because now they can actually use these specs as well, and to give more ways to, for instance, in kinds of metrics to monitor your monoliths, right?
Yeah, the other good example is a good use case is MicroProfile Health. I know it's it's now it's both monolith and microservice can be deployed to the cloud. And then for monolith, maybe you can go through the lift and shift. Basically, you directly containerize your monolith and then push to the cloud. And I know it's one customer is asking for the MicroProfile Health. Basically, they also want this monolith to directly communicate with Kubernetes. So with MicroProfile Health, for example, in the readiness, and then they can, in the monolith, they can directly put in the logic to say, is my database ready? Can I contact my database? If that's no, and then they could just say this monolith is not up. So this is kind of the other example, for deploy your monolith to the cloud, and then you can use the MicroProfile as well.
Okay, nice. Let's take some questions for the audience. First, Luis said, nice Java jacket, Emily. Yes, it's so beautiful.
Oh,
Again,
thank
this
you.
one's from, it's the Java champion one, right?
Oh yeah, the Java champion is
Oh,
one
yeah.
of my favorites.
I usually say the best clothes that I have right now is from conference. It's any kind of award such as Java champion. But anyway, I have one good question from William. Why should I use microprofile instead of Spring Boot?
Yeah, actually, I wrote an article about compare MicroProfile versus Spring. First of all, I have to say Spring is a great framework as well. For MicroProfile is at the moment is kind of de facto standard for doing microservices. Once you use these APIs, and then you can you can deploy your app to load to the runtime, such as Open Liberty, Quarkus, Wildfly, Payara, Halidon, and etc. etc. So basically, it's once you know MicroProfile, you can move your application across runtime. And then once you learn it, you can just use it to write your microservices and without need to worry about this migration. And the other thing is because this is a huge open source community, it's not only owned by one company. So basically, as you can see, is Roberto from Red Hat, from IBM, and there's others from Tommy Tribe, Payara, and Oracle. So we, and also some other smaller smaller companies, and plus some individuals, they contribute their time to work on these specifications. So yeah, and the second thing is MicroProfile is kind of simpler. So we have done in IBM, we have done an experiment to directly migrate cloud computing application from Spring to MicroProfile. So the team found out is much simpler. To migrate to MicroProfile. So less line code and etc. So it's easier to manage.
Oh,
Yeah,
Also,
so
I have a sorry, just one more thing. Also, is I have I have a YouTube video and compare Spring and MicroProfile. If you are interested, just directly Google that. Sorry.
no worries. Yeah, I think you pretty much summarized a lot of my ideas as well. But I usually like to give an extra idea, which is, well, I've been developing applications since in the last 15 years, and I'm not sure if everyone remembers when Spring 1 came out, and it came in the dark ages of HTTP2, where everything was just required like 5-6 classes to implement an HTTP service, and Spring came. And I love Spring. I used it at the time, and I still use it from time to time. And Spring actually simplified the model back then. And what's interesting and then we're talking these are maybe like 15 years ago, right? And I believe Spring was important in the sense that it create a competitive market, right? Where you have these two projects like Java E, at the time called J2EE, trying to innovate, and then Spring comes in and then innovates, and then basically they were tackling each other, trying to beat each other all the time. And unfortunately, a few years ago, when Java E kind of became dormant on Oracle and Spring became alone, I think we kind of lost that competition, which I call healthy, right? Because you only innovate if you have someone that you had to beat. If you don't have any, I mean, even Spring guys, they didn't have much competition and they have done amazing things. But I do believe that when you have more competition, it's where you innovate the most. So, for instance, if you look on what we did, or what Red Hat did with Quarkus, where we started to use build time compilation, and Spring didn't have that. Now they just announced that they're going to do that as well, and they actually showed pretty amazing results a couple of weeks ago on that department. I can't stop thinking that maybe that they have done that because we actually were able to innovate, so they have to innovate on their side as well. So I believe that having multiple competition is it's healthy for the environment and for the community as a whole, because we keep pushing each other to make greater things for people to use. And then in the end, it's going to be a matter of taste. If you like Spring, just use it. It will work very well for what you have to do. And if you want to use MicroProfile with either Liberty or Quarkus, just use it as well, because it will still be able to do whatever you want. And if you want to use something else other than Java, like Ruby, Golang, whatever, it's probably going to fix your issue as well. So just pick whatever you feel more comfortable with.
Are there any things in particular MicroProfile's been pushing recently? Some new developments that have come out with the, I believe, 3.2s, the more recent releases of MicroProfile?
Currently, we are working on the MicroProfile 4.0. So
4.0, awesome.
Yeah,
so what's coming out with that?
Yeah. So it's great. So all the specifications have added a lot of features in the MicroProfile 4.0. And hopefully we can release in October, because at the moment, and we are working on the MicroProfile working group. So basically, MicroProfile has been running for 4 years, and then is quite successful on the Eclipse Foundation in order to protect all the kind of any further potential IP issues and etc. So ask the MicroProfile to set up a MicroProfile working group, so to standardize it. And so we are nearly finished off the MicroProfile working group. We just submitted the charter last week. So as a final version charter last week. Hopefully in October we can go ahead and release MicroProfile 4.0. So at the moment the latest is MicroProfile 3.3. And then the 4.0 will be a major release, and there's a few quite really awesome features in the individual MicroProfile specifications.
Something you're particularly excited about, Emily or Roberto?
Yeah, let me before actually answering the question about things that are coming up, let me just try to explain something about how MicroProfile operates. So
sure.
MicroProfile itself is not like in Spring in the sense that it provides you an implementation of an API. So yes, Spring doesn't provide implementations of certain APIs, but most of Spring is the implementation itself is the framework. Now, MicroProfile on its own, it's only a set of APIs, nothing else, right? For instance, you have a MicroProfile config, which is implemented by SmallRide config, which is an open source project hosted by Red Hat. Then you have Payara config, which is built by the Payara people. And then you have, for instance, Geronimo config, which is an Apache project. Basically, you have 3 implementations that implement the same spec, which is MicroProfile config. So in the sense that MicroProfile itself doesn't provide you the framework. It just provides you the APIs, and then you have the projects that actually implement those APIs. So like the ones that I told you right now. So why do you gain things like this? So the idea here is that you specify and standardize things that everyone knows that they're going to use. And then implementations like small right config or Geronimo config, they can innovate and do things that we're not even sure if they are going to be used or not by the community. But we can try them out on the implementation side of things. And when you pick up an implementation to use, you know that you're going to have the spec available to you. That's the minimum API available on MicroProfile, and then you can always go and use specific APIs from the implementations. And then what will happen on that is it allows us to grab feedback from the community and maybe even go and graduate implementation features to API level features, and then everyone else has to implement them, right? So for instance, one of the specs that me and Emily work the most is a MicroProfile config. And these might not be like a huge feature, but for instance, on config 2.0, we're going to support property expansion, which means is if you have a template with a dollar bracket, we would just replace it with another configuration that we'll find based on that property name, right? And then you can compose multiple properties. I mean, it doesn't seem to be like a groundbreaking feature, but the point was the feature was not available on MicroProfile config, but it was available on the implementation side. So for instance, small right config already implemented that a few months ago. And that allows us to retrieve some community feedback and actually try out the feature, take up some of the rough edges, and then actually deliver something that in the end it's going to be more stable. Kind of like if you think what JDK is doing with the preview release features, right? It's not exactly the same, but you can think in something in a similar thing, right? On the opposite side, we could just release features that we think that might be useful, but without people using them, we're not even sure if they're going to be there or not for a good time. It's going to be useful, and then in the end, you're gonna have something you're gonna have to maintain in the API and the spec. That's not really that's just gonna pain everybody by being there, right? I'm not sure if that makes sense.
Oh, I guess that's the beauty of the whole community, right? Because we have the community who create API, who creates a specification, and the community, on the other hand, also give us feedback to, okay, how can I improve that? How can I use that? In particular, the dollar thing on configuration to me was amazing. Basically, for sure, I run in several Java applications at Platform.sh, and with that configuration, I can have my default configuration to run locally. Something like, okay, I can install my MongoDB and run my MongoDB on my whole notebook. And I push to the cloud, use, I don't know, maybe Platform.sh. I can override the whole configuration. I can override the credential, the user, the password. And the whole point, I don't need to know that credential. I don't need to know the user, the password, and that's the 12-factor application, right? So I can override the whole configuration by environment.
Yeah, I
That's
mean
Yeah.
that's something that you can do, but you can do pretty much crazy things with that. But yeah, I mean that's the whole point, right? So the point of MicroProfile as a spec is to pick up the great pieces that are coming out from the community and try to make a standard API that everyone can use. And on the implementation side, we just try out things, and the great deal about that is if we try something that doesn't work, we can just trash it, and then not many people are going to be mad about us because it didn't even make into the API or the spec, so no one was using it unless like just a very small portion of people that are using it on the implementation side. So that allows us to have like a clean API that everyone can use and everyone be happy about.
Right.
Okay.
So it's
Go
sorry.
ahead, Emily.
So it's the other thing to add is the kind of this is a kind of community. This is a greater community. Like we are developers help, like developers. Basically, it's we receive all these issues from all over the place, from the microprofile, like end users, implementers, and etc. It's like because of these issues and all these problems and etc. And then kind of this is the kind of this is real customer use case. So that means the kind of the we are develop something for ourselves. So this is really good. And for some issues we are not sure about, as Roberto said, we can try it out in the like some implementations first, and then bring back to the spec. The other things that I want to add is the microprofile is different from some other standard and etc. Microprofile allows breaking changes. Basically, if like we have done something wrong, so we don't carry that burden forever. So we have the ability to, we have the opportunity to fix it. But we're trying really, really hard not to introduce breaking changes just freely. We only like do these breaking changes absolutely necessary. We made a terrible mistake. We have to fix it, and then we do it. And then even for this, we at the moment we do it like once a year. So that's why the microprofile carries break changes. With this, like in the microprofile specifications, we document clearly what are the breaker changes. So if you are using microprofile for the O in the future, you just go to that section to find out what kind of breaker changes and what's the migration path for you available to you.
Yeah, it's not something that happens very often, but I think people have to realize that in this microservice world, things evolve. I mean, technically, in our area, things evolve very, very fast, and microservices will evolve even faster, right? So, for instance, we're now considering deprecating one of our specs, which is called open tracing. The thing with that is at the time, if you know about open tracing allows you to trace the request across your services, right? Just like a very quick explanation on that. And at the time when we built that, there were a couple of projects or APIs that were trying to do tracing. One was called open services, or other was called open tracing. So we ended up going with open tracing. But now they come to realize that there are plenty of common points between open systems and open tracing. So they kind of joined in an open effort called open telemetry. So now open tracing and open systems are kind of end of life. So we probably have to move to open telemetry. So probably going to deprecate open tracing. But we're talking about an implementation and a spec that's probably like 2 years old, I believe, or even 3. So it's really an API doesn't have much time, so we have to make those kind of quick decisions, right, and adjust to what's happening on the market and what's happening on the entire landscape, right?
Yeah. By the way, when you talk about microservice, you usually talk about, uh, for sure, Jakarta E. Could you explain a little bit more the difference between Jakarta E and, for sure, what is Jakarta E, and between Jakarta E and microprofile?
Right. Jakarta EE is Java EE moved to Eclipse Foundation and rebranded to be a Jakarta EE. So Jakarta EE currently undergoing a release, Jakarta EE9. So basically, it's trying to change all the namespace from Java, JavaX to the Jakarta, the because of the trademark and etc. So it's the relationship between MicroProfile and Jakarta EE is the MicroProfile actually borrowed the full Jakarta EE specifications, CDI, JAX-S, JSON-B, and JSON-P. So basically, that's the kind of bigger foundation, especially CDI. CDI is everywhere. CDI is kind of the essential building block in MicroProfile. So MicroProfile and Jakarta is from the API point of view is quite looks like from the similar family. So once you know Jakarta, and then if you use MicroProfile like the APIs is kind of once you understand the CDI. MicroProfile is heavily used annotations and etc. Is kind of very, very similar. It's not much learning curve for you. The other thing is Jakarta E and MicroProfile, they work together really well. So basically, when you do your microservices or you do a modern cloud native applications, you should use both Jakarta E and MicroProfile. So they form a really good ecosystem. Just one more, for example, like a MicroProfile JWT. So MicroProfile JWT is kind of for secure microservices. However, it works together with Jakarta security. So on the back end, you have to use rules allowed. That's directly from Jakarta security. And the MicroProfile add a couple claims in the JWT token. So it's for the backend to authorize the user and etc.
For somebody who's a little less familiar, what does CDI stand for? It's a big part.
Yeah,
Context and dependency
injection.
injection. Yeah.
Thank you.
So it's equivalent to Spring Beans in a sense. If whoever is familiar with Spring Beans, I'm not sure if you are, but
I've seen it over Otavio's shoulders a little bit, reviewing his code.
Yeah. Yeah, but going a little bit in detail, CDI. So CDI became the building block of Java E in Jakarta. So to give like a very quick explanation, so when AJB came, right, and basically on J2E, so AJB introduced the sense of like dependency injection as well, and version of control, all of that. So in the sense that you won't manage your own classes or your own instances of objects, it will be the server to manage that, because it allows you, for instance, for the server to declarative manage your transactions and things like that. But at the time, so AJB, which I mean, it made sense for the time that what we were, right? So for instance, there was like the AJB thread pool, and whenever you have your own instance of an AJB, you'll get it from the pool, which if all the transaction you have all it was already enhanced with a lot of services behind it, right? And basically the idea is that you will just pick your regular POJO, you annotate it with a couple of annotations, and you have plenty of other services behind it without you having to worry about it, right? But the issue with AJBs at the time, which were called AJB, stands for Enterprise Java Beans, it was like all or nothing, right? So it's kind of like you add an AJB and you get the transactions even if you didn't require them, right? Which basically at the point turned AJB into this heavyweight object that you had to deal with. Now CDI took a completely different approach. So in the sense that is that CDI will replace AJB, it's almost already replaced it, but in the sense that CDI becomes transforms whatever object you want into a CDI being aware object, right? And then you can, instead of starting with a couple of services already behind it, you just declarative add them to wherever you need. So for instance, if you require transactions, you just add the transactional annotation and you get transactions, right? If you don't have that, you don't get transactions. Au contrary to AJB, where you just have them all the time, which basically turn your object into a heavyweight object. So the idea is that AJB is heavyweight and CDI is lightweight. And then, I mean, there are a lot of other differences, but the idea with CDI is mostly to deprecate AJB, and in the sense that allows you to register your own services behind your CDI bean, plus allows you as well, if you want to create your own transaction, if you want to create your own managed service aware, you can annotate your CDI bean wherever thing you want, and then you just add a declarative to your Pojo.
Okay.
Yeah.
Also, you talk a lot about CDI. There is a discussion about CDI Lite, right? Could you
Yeah.
explain to us what is CDI Lite and is that a new CDI feature?
Actually, I raised this issue on the CDI GitHub repo. I raised two issues. I think this is kind of the future CDI focus is once the Jakarta E9 is out. We should do two things. One, first thing is as we discussed earlier, and Roberto went further details about EGB replacement. So I raised the first thing is we should make a CDI to replace EJB. So at the moment, the startup and also scheduler. So basically, it's all having kind of the alternative how to achieve them using a CDI instead of using EJB. So in this case, in the future in Jakarta, we can just focus on CDI and gradually sunset EJB. So the second thing is what you are talking about, CDI Lite. So go back to the history why I raised this CDI Lite is because some CDI is kind of is great. It has a lot of features like extensions and portable extensions and all the scopes like application scope, request scope, conversation scope, etc. And however, the things that have moved on, like Quarkus, like Halidon, so they do a compile time the wiring. So basically, it's they they want to wire everything at the compile time. So it's in this case the portable extension and some other conversation scoped and session scoped is kind of less important. So in this way, is in order for other the new runtime to be able to comply with the CDI, so we need to come up with kind of the new smaller bucket in CDI. So that's why it's kind of I opened this up for CDI Lite. In this case, maybe MicroProfile can use CDI Lite instead of the whole CDI. So in this case, some other Quarkus and Halidon can just directly consume that that portion instead of consume the whole CDI implementation. At the moment, is kind of Weld and open web beans. So at the moment, we are still at listed when I raised this issue I listed what features should be in the CDI Lite. However, we still discuss and what is must-have features in this CDI Lite. I think portable extensions is still in the discussion point. So we haven't made a decision as yet. So it's useful, and but how much is possible to be to achieve the kind of that usage via some other ways and etc. So it's yeah. So I think it's this is two issues I would like to see being worked on once the Jakarta E9 is out.
Yes, Emily made a good point about CDI Lite. So there, I'll add as well that, for instance, and the example she used about Quarkus or Halidon. So Halidon in itself, it's only tries to target MicroProfile, right? And Quarkus itself, we target MicroProfile and a couple of other specs, but we don't want to target the entire Jakarta API, right? Because I mean, Jakarta, and I mean, I love Jakarta. I've worked into Tommy, which is also an application server that supports Jakarta, but it has like a huge baggage already behind it. And maybe with the move to Eclipse, we were able to remove some of those baggage and have Jakarta to become more clean. But I mean, at this point, there are specs in Jakarta that people don't use anymore because things evolve, things that move on, and but they're still there, and they're still there for compatibility reasons. But the thing is, if you want to bring new players into the Jakarta / MicroProfile world, you cannot basically tell them that you have to implement all the entire baggage that they have behind us, right? So moving into the CDI Lite conversation, for instance, because CDI was built at the time where we had IJBs and were like being fully used into Java E application at the time. It was also built for JSF in mind, right? So part of the TCK, which basically is a task compatibility kit that tells you that a CDI implementation is compatible with the API, forces you to implement the JSF support, right? But not every server, not every container out there wants to implement JSF support because I mean, I also love JSF, but usually people prefer to build their UIs in different technologies these days. So should we force people that want to use CDI in a light way to have to implement other specs that they're not interested with? So that's the point, and that's the question, right? And I think that doing that move also will allow us to call in other vendors that they know, oh, if I want to be MicroProfile compliant, I only have to implement these certain amount of specs, right? Instead of having to implement the entire full suite of specs plus MicroProfile plus Jakarta, which is like a tremendous amount of work for little gain if we're talking a new vendor, right?
Yeah, those are a good point. We have more questions for the audience. So let's take the first one from Victor. He said, now today, each cloud vendor has its own serverless SDK. Is there any roadmap to standardize Java serverless?
Well, I've seen some efforts on that, but it's not completely my area, so I cannot tell for sure. I know there are a couple of people looking into that, but my impression is at this point, APIs from serverless on all these cloud vendors, they are very different from each other, so it's quite hard to make something that will work out of the box on everyone. But that certainly will be interesting if we can do something like that. Maybe that can be a MicroProfile project, for instance. Even if we have different APIs from different cloud vendors for serverless, let's just say if we have another project on MicroProfile, which is the reactive messaging, right? And reactive messaging is actually, we're able to build an API that works with Kafka, Camel, ActiveMQ, MQTT, MQTT. I mean, plenty of other message brokers, even JMS, right? So it's only a matter to find out what are the common pieces that we can extract to be able to provide a common API for you to use, and then implementations will handle that complexity of targeting the different cloud vendors and how they move and how they call their things, right?
Right. So it's that's quite interesting. Like for serverless, so serverless. So it's like so what is a serverless? And I think earlier this year people did like debating what are the serverless. If the server is is a serverless, is kind of the you only have the application without a server. Or if the runtime is really small and tiny, and then your application including like the runtime, and then it's kind of it directly deployed to the cloud. As you know, like Quarkus is trying also is target for serverless because it start up really fast, and then it's your application and it's very tiny, and your application packaged with the Quarkus, and you can directly use the Quarkus API, MicroProfile API, to directly like achieve that aspect or serverless will give you. So I think I think the more experiment with the serverless. Maybe one day we will reach conclusion what kind of the requirement for serverless, and then we could have the specifications, and also is useful APIs or something, and including TCKs. Maybe it can be experimented in MicroProfile or in some other foundations and etc. So for my understanding is if your application and package with kind of nothing, or deployed directly as a function, or package with a very small like a runtime, and then you can go ahead to deploy to the cloud. That's yeah, have your problem solved.
We have another question actually from the chat from Karina. We touched very briefly, I guess, on maybe using MicroProfile to still build your monolith, but her question is there some scenarios that you've heard of, come across, or can think of MicroProfile not being the best solution for the kind of application and needing to go for purely Jakarta EE?
Right.
No, I mean, I believe, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, you go ahead. That's fine.
Okay. No, I mean, I believe that, like Emily said, like a while ago, Jakarta and MicroProfile, they complement each other, right? They're not competing against each other. So, for instance, when we're talking about configuration, every application these days requires configuration, even if it's a monolith, right? If you're talking a very basic application, most of the times you're going to have a database, and most of the times you're going to have a login and password and a connection string to connect to the database. So you have to set up that somewhere. Where do you set that up, right? So MicroProfile config gives you an option on how to set that up, right? And extraordinarily, Jakarta doesn't have a way to set up any kind of configuration at all, which is unfortunate. And that has to come from MicroProfile config. And I know for a fact that Otavio has been trying to push MicroProfile config to Jakarta because it is a pain in the sense that Jakarta, there is no standard way to set up configurations, right? So for instance, if you look into JPA and you want to set up some JPA configuration, you have to set it up on persistence XML. That's fine. But then if you have some JAX-RS resource and you want to set up some configuration, you have to set up on another file. And then if the configurations are inside your files on the application, there is no way for you to override them outside of your application. Right. So it is a mess, right? And MicroProfile config actually came and solved those issues, right? So that's one of the interesting things as well, because on how projects operate. So one of the ideas between MicroProfile and Jakarta was also to use MicroProfile as a playground to try out new stuff, and then if they become really relevant and stable, then they might be able to move to Jakarta. So configuration might be a perfect candidate for that. Sure. But even if it doesn't move, that's a perfect spec that you can use with your monolith, right?
Yeah. The other thing is once the MicroProfile working group is set up, is the MicroProfile specs kind of is also quite is a kind of you can view as a quite a good standard for like have the IP and etc. or sorted and etc. You can freely to use it together with Jakarta. Hopefully, my next wish is Jakarta can directly be able to depend on MicroProfile specifications that has Otavio's problem sorted. So. By the way, I add a little bit about the deployment difference between the kind of microservice and monolith. I think this is kind of impact a little bit Jakarta and MicroProfile. In Jakarta, there's a deployment section, and potentially is one server could have a multiple application deployed. However, in the microservice world, like one runtime, basically you containerize it, your application directly package it itself together with the runtime. So basically it's a one runtime, one application. So if you trying to use MicroProfile, for example, health or metrics, it has an endpoint. So that endpoint, like a host and a port and a /health. So that is for the whole like a runtime. So if you have like a multiple deployment directly deployed multiple monoliths like deployed to the same one runtime, you will get aggregation view of this health status. So I think it's a slightly different is the kind of deployment model difference.
Okay.
Nice. So we just have 3 minutes left. The final words. I have one question from Vinicius, and guess what? That's a good one. Thank you, Vinicius, for all the questions. Thank the whole audience for the questions. Uh, what's your favorite microprofile specification?
That's very hard. That's very hard. So I worked on extensively probably from the from day one on MicroProfile. I work on config. That's the first specification. I feel like that's my baby MicroProfile config. That's the first ever MicroProfile specification. Test the water and test the release and etc. So I worked heavily on the fault tolerance as well. So I love them all. However, I think because I started first with the config, so it has my attention a little bit more.
Yeah, I
And
will
it's
say that
kind of
the
used. Yeah, go for it.
yeah, I will say that mine is config as well. For the sole reason that is the foundation for pretty much everything else. I mean, there are specs that can work without configuration, of course, but every time you get to a point that you require to have some kind of configurations, and so every time you end up going to our spec to retrieve. I mean, configuration itself is a very small spec, but it ends up being in the center of everything. So, for instance, as in Quarkus, we configuration has a big play in how we build stuff. And we're always trying to figure out like new ways to figure out to improve it. Even now, I have a couple of ideas. So, and I even discussed that on the spec side of things. So, for instance, configuration, we introduced a way to convert strings to other objects, which is actually something that people do all the time, and there is no specification to do conversion, right? So maybe we require the conversion specification. And it's interesting because maybe config may introduce other specs like the conversion spec in the future. We don't know. But yes, I guess that's my favorite spec.
And guess what? My favorite specification is, yes, configuration as well. That's why I fight so much to try to bring in to Jakarta E. It's a small specification, as you mentioned before. However, It makes my life so easier. That's amazing.
It is, right? Because all the time you require, I mean, what is configuration? Configuration is something that allows you to change the parameters and how something operates. And if you think in an abstract way, you have configuration everywhere, right? If you go to your fridge, you have a configuration to set up temperature. That's a configuration, right?
Yeah.
And it, it it is a pain when you build an application and you're not able to change any parameters, right? And you have to basically go into this obscure file, change something, rebuild the entire application, deploy it all over again, just because you want to change some particular aspect how the application operates, right? So that's a pain.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, over 1 hour. That was an incredible, amazing conversation about Eclipse microprofile. Thank you, Emily, for your participation.
Thank you for having me.
And yes, that was our pleasure, right, Chat?
Absolutely.
Thank you,
Thank you, guys.
Roberto. Yeah, that was great to learn about Eclipse microprofile. If you'd like to know more about Eclipse microprofile, if you'd like to know how you can run this application in the cloud, why not? Let me share to you one link where Platform.sh has several uh, samples that you can run your Eclipse microprofile with uh, Platform.sh. We have support to several vendors, so if you want to run Apache Tommy, Turntail, Clonzu, Oracle Helidon, Opera Liberty, Wildfly, Payara Micro, and Quarkus. I share the link where you can see the whole sample, the whole templates, and have fun. Thank you, everybody, and hopefully I see you next week in the next Deploy Friday at Platform Message.
Thank you both. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very
Thank
much.
you. Bye.
Bye bye.
Okay.